follows is a brief construction montage. Flashback and a flashback. Soon after montage. Yesterday, meanwhile, back in the lowlands. A few moments later, more moments later, in the void. A little later, much later, much later, much later. The following Thursday, later that same evening. Just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours 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 later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later, many unbearable hours later, and now for sure, 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next day, the next day, the next day, the following day, tomorrow, the very next evening, day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, several days later, 1 week later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 6 months later, several months later, many months later, 70 years later, 75 years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, 1 eternity later. So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab opening night, a lot of boring math later, many tic-tacs later, 1 semester later, 1 debt to society later, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 long angry line later, 1 shift later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 1 wiener later, 1 pair of pants later, 82 kilometers later, 298 frozen patties later, thousands of tears later, 3,000 whoop-whoos later, 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. A few inches later, eventually, several bad puns later. Graduation day. Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Excellent.